Insight class, which is where First Presbyterian's identity, faith, and values meets today's world. And again, we're having our classes on Zoom and recording them for people to watch. The recordings get on our church YouTube site a couple of hours after we have the class. So we typically be getting around 10 people for the Insight class sort of live, and then we have around 10 people that watch the whole thing on YouTube later in the week. We're starting a new series on Paul, the Apostle Paul, and we're very glad to have Gary Connors-Boe with us. Most of us know Gary because he's a member of First Presbyterian Church. He is an ordained Lutheran minister and has had a very interesting career with not only leading congregations, but also working at Four Oaks, helping struggling young people as well. So Gary's going to do several classes, and so we want to save a few things for future introductions. So I'll leave it at that. We have a hard stop at 9:50 so that people can move over to the streaming of the Sunday service at 10. And also, as has already been alluded to, we have Gary has made notes about the class. There's a link to the notes on the church website, and also there will be a link to the notes on the recording of this class. Underneath that, there'll be a link to those notes there as well. So the notes are really quite extensive, and appreciate your doing that, Gary. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Gary. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me to do this. I don't think we're going to get through the material that I want to cover, which is to say an overview, a biography of St. Paul today. However, if you go to the notes, everything that I intend to say in the next 50 minutes are in the notes. So if we don't get to the finish line by way of Zoom, you can download the notes and pick up what we are not able to cover. We have a couple of experts with us on the subject of St. Paul. Tom and Gingy have been part of the more extended, in-depth class that I've been doing over a period of 3 or 4 months, I think, that helped me to prepare for this. And so I've got 2 assistant teachers here this morning. I would also say that if there are questions that you have that don't get answered in any of these classes, please feel free to email me and ask your question or give me the comment, and I'll be glad to respond. My email address it's all one word. It's Gary, Gary, Connors, Connors, Boe, Boe, all one word, GaryConnorsBoe @gmail.com. So I'd be delighted to respond to your comments or try to answer your questions. By way of background, the material that I use to prepare for this class includes a number of books, and I just want to mention them. And there's a book called, and I can send you this bibliography, but A Week in the Life of Corinth is one. First Paul by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. Jesus and Empire by Richard Horsley. If you were only to buy one book on the subject of Paul, it might be N.T. Wright's book, Paul, which I use. Also, Paul Among the People by Sarah Rudin is another one. Cities of God, and then those are books that I purchased. They're ebooks, so I don't have them to show you. But then The New Testament World by a guy by the name of Bruce Molina, who died recently, but he taught it at Creighton University. God and Empire by John Dominic Crossan, and which is quite good. And then finally, In Search of Paul, also by Crossan, but by another New Testament scholar, Jonathan L. Reed. And I thought I knew a lot about Paul before I started teaching back in August. But I found out in reading these books that I didn't know nearly as much as I needed to in order to be a good explicator of his life and his theology. By way of coming attractions, I want to mention that beginning on the 19th, that's a Tuesday at 10 o'clock, I'm going to continue with these Tuesday classes, and the subject will be the historical Jesus. And I've already started my reading on that. And the books that I'm using to get up to speed on that are E.P. Sanders' Jesus. And then this is really something. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of this, but this book is the first volume. It's Jesus, a Marginal Jew by John P. Meyer. And it's 1,000 pages. It's the first of 6 volumes. I'm into my second volume. And I've got a third volume on hand, and then I got 3 more volumes coming in an Amazon truck. So my goal, my humble goal is to be the foremost authority on Jesus in the world. So
good luck.
Yeah, exactly. So at any rate, if you're available to tune into that, again, that'll start on the 19th. That's a Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and we'll go till whenever.
Gary, how do people sign up for that?
We'll have something in the newsletter, probably the link. I've been using a Zoom link that Heather set up for me, and so we'll get that information out to you. All right, so Paul, and I'm just going to follow along with this this handout that's available to you on the link. Paul was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and I'm going to use modern place names for the locations that Paul was. I'll mention the ancient names, but then I'm just going to use modern place names. Tarsus was in south East Turkey, modern day Turkey. And it was in a province called Cilicia. And Paul was born to a prosperous family that was in the tent making business. And a word about tents. Anyone own a tent? I have a tent that I haven't used in several years, but tents were a very useful item and a very popular item in Paul's day. Many more people own tents than percentage-wise than people would today, because some use them for houses. In the cities of the Greco-Roman world, there was a housing shortage, so some people lived outside of the city walls in tents. If you were traveling to someplace, you would bring a tent with you because there were not motels or hotels in those days. So you would, travel down the road, and then when night came and you were done for the day, you would set up your tent and sleep in your tent. If you were traveling by ship, there weren't cabins on board ships. You would sleep on the deck of the ship in the tent that you brought with you. So the tent making business was a big business indeed. And it wasn't just tents that tent makers made. They also made awnings. This is, of course, in days before air conditioning. And so if you were an artisan, if you had a little shop, you would typically work out of doors on the street. The streets were quite wide to accommodate that. And to protect yourself from the sun, you would have an awning that was made by tent makers. Because tent makers worked in leather, they also made sandals, belts, and other leather products. So it was quite a big business. Paul's family, Paul's dad had Roman citizenship, which he would have gotten. The way you got Roman citizenship in those days, you could inherit it, as Paul did, but typically you would get it if you had served as a non-Roman in the military, which Paul's dad would not have because he was a Jew and Jews did not serve in the Roman military. But if you were regarded as an important supplier to the Roman army, and there was a fair-sized garrison in Tarsus in Paul's day, then you could acquire Roman citizenship. And that is very likely how Paul's dad received his Roman citizenship, and how then it would have been passed on as a legacy to his son, Paul. Another word about tents is that they were not only made out of leather, but primarily they were made out of the wool of black goats. And the material was named after the province in which Paul lived, because there were a number, apparently these black goats were raised in the province of Cilicia. And the reason that the wool from black goats was used was because when it's woven into a fabric, it's very porous, so it allows a breeze to come through until it gets wet. And then it shrinks and it becomes waterproof. And so anyway, that's a little bit about tent making, and it was a big business, and Paul learned the business in his family. I mentioned the family was a Pharisaic family. I was asked in the last class I taught about the background of the Pharisees and how you became a Pharisee and so forth. And it wasn't clear to me, although I've read a lot about the Pharisees, it wasn't clear to me how you became a Pharisee, and it still isn't. I've done some reading about that since, but Pharisees were a kind of a party within Judaism, and they were very scrupulous about the cultic rules that identified a person as Jewish. You probably all know that Jews were circumcised, the males were circumcised, and that they ate kosher, but there were other cultic rules that most Jews, were, kind of scrupulous about keeping, but the Pharisees were especially scrupulous about keeping. And they were also among the, I guess you'd call the more liberal Jews of the day. And by that, I mean that while another party within Judaism, Sadducee party, only really gave much credence to the first 5 books of the Bible, otherwise known as the Torah or Tanakh, Pharisees regarded as equally important, probably, all of the rest of the books that we now have in Hebrew scripture, or what we refer to commonly as the Old Testament, including oral traditions, which later became known as the Mishnah or the Talmud. And the Pharisees were also more democratic. The Sadducee party, which ran the temple in Jerusalem, really thought that the most important people religiously were the Sadducean priests. You might liken this to some of the Reformation stuff. There was a very strong hierarchy within Roman Catholicism at the time of the Reformation, but the Reformers, Luther and Calvin, more believed in the priesthood of all believers, and so did the Pharisees. And so the special rules that were cultic rules of separation that the Sadducean priests in the temple in Jerusalem obeyed, the Pharisees thought that everyone should obey. And they had a saying that a pious Jewish mamzer, which is a word for bastard, a pious Jewish bastard was closer to God than an ignorant Jerusalem priest. So these were very much more democratic religious persons, very scrupulous in keeping the law. And Paul apparently was a bit of a scripture prodigy. Now, we've all heard stories about kids who were like chess prodigies. Paul would have been a scripture prodigy. And it was not uncommon for people in those days to memorize nearly all of what we now know of as Hebrew scripture. And Paul may have been one of those. And as a prodigy, he would very likely have memorized all of the first 5 books of the Bible, all of the Psalms, and many of the prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and so forth. He would also have been one who, as a pious Pharisee, would have had, have you ever seen one of these boxes that Jewish people today wear on their forehead? They're called tefillin. And inside are little scripts that include some of the 10 Commandments and the Shema, hear, O Lord, your God is one, and so forth. And so Paul, as a kid, was a very knowledgeable and very pious kid in the tent making business, who learned the business there. And later on in life, that was useful for him because all he would have needed were some of the tent making tools, and he could earn a living in the various cities that he visited as a knowledgeable and skilled tent maker. I also want to say that in Tarsus, there was a school, a university, that was notable because it was regarded in Paul's day as the top school of rhetoric. Now, what rhetoric is, for those of you who may have forgotten from earlier days in school, is basically the art of debating and making arguments. And there are rhetorical skills that people are taught as rhetoricians that Paul uses frequently in his letters. And for that reason, we think that Paul may have studied rhetoric in Tarsus, probably, if he did, at the university there. One other thing to say about Paul was that he was, Acts says, and Paul also says that he was zealous for the law. Okay. Now I want to say a little bit about zealous. Zealous is not just an adverb that is, is used there. It had a special meaning in Paul's day. And to understand that meaning, I want to take you back to the time of the Exodus. And, Moses led the people out of Egypt, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then toward the end of that, they began to move to the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and would eventually go around the Promised Land up to Jericho, cross over the Jordan River at Jericho, and enter the Promised Land. Well, the country that they would have had to pass through in order to get to Jericho was a country called Moab. And apparently the king of Moab was concerned about this horde of immigrants coming through his country. He did not have a fence up to keep them out. And so what he did was he sent his chief priest, and Moabs were not Jews. They did not worship Yahweh, but he sent his chief priest, a guy by the name of Balak, out to meet this immigrant horde and to cast a curse upon them, which the king of Moab presumably thought would somehow be a way of stopping these people from entering his territory. As he approached, he was riding on a donkey. An angel appeared on the road to stop him. He couldn't see the angel, but his donkey could. And this guy by the way, his name was Balaam. And he couldn't see the angel, but his donkey could. He's known as Balaam's ass, this donkey. And he stopped dead in his tracks and would not move any further. And despite whippings and other encouragements to move down the road, the Balaam's ass refused to move, and then began to speak to Balaam, telling him what he saw. And Balaam then began to see this angel, and rather than curse the people, decided that the best course of action was actually to bless them. Okay. Well, he went back to the king of Moab, told him what had happened, didn't get the reward that he was to get for doing the cursing. And so the king of Moab thought, well, how am I going to stop these people from coming into my land? I know what I'll do. I will send out a bevy of beauties, of Moabite beauties, to go into the camp and seduce the men of these, itinerant Egyptians, and encourage them, to do a 180 and go back to where they came from. So he sends in this group of very attractive women into the camp, and they do what they were sent there to do. And there was a guy by the name of Phinehas, I think we translate it as Phineas, who was a nephew of Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was well, wait a minute, let me stop. When this began to happen, God was upset that the people were the men of Israel were cavorting with these women, and sent a plague into the camp. Phinehas, or Phineas, was outraged by what was going on. He took a spear, went into one of the tents, and ran his spear through a couple who were coupling. And with this, the plague was lifted. And as a result, this nephew of Aaron, actually a son of Aaron, I'm sorry, a son of Aaron, Phineas or Phinehas, was made the chief priest. And God made a covenant with the family of Phinehas or Phineas that they would be priests forever. And as a result of Phinehas's zeal for the Lord, the plague was lifted. The king of Moab gave up trying to stop the people from coming through his land. And so the phrase zeal for the Lord referred to somebody with, that kind of willingness, to go the extra mile to protect the people of God and God's will. So when Paul refers to himself as one who has zeal for the law, that phrase in the first century, if you were to get into a time machine and mention that phrase, would have, in the minds of Jewish people, have caused them to think about Phineas, and to think about Paul as somebody who was seriously religious. Okay. All right. At the age of 18, Paul leaves Tarsus. About the age of 18, we're not quite sure, but around the age of 18, Paul leaves Tarsus, this biblical prodigy, this skilled tent maker, this skilled rhetorician, and he moves to Jerusalem, where he has a sister there living with her family, and he probably moves in with his sister's family and begins to study with various teachers in Jerusalem, including the great Rabbi Gamliel. He likely works in the temple tannery and tent making facility, which was part of the temple establishment. Jerusalem was a town of about 40,000. And but 3 times a year, for Passover, for the Feast of Weeks, which we call Pentecost, and for the Feast of Sukkot, which is a harvest festival in late summer, Jewish people would pilgrims would come to Jerusalem in vast numbers, as many as 300, 400, 500,000. And because the town could not accommodate them in terms of there being, places for them to stay, they would have brought tents, or they would rent tents once they got into town. And so the temple establishment made money by also selling tents, and they were made from the hides of the animals that were sacrificed there, or renting tents. And so Paul gets a job, presumably working in the tent making industry there. So from about the year 24 of the Common Era, or what we sometimes call AD, Annos Domini, in the year of our Lord, to 31, Paul is working in the temple tannery, tent making facility, and he comes to the attention of high-ranking Pharisaic, because Paul's a Pharisee, Pharisaic members of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin is the 70-member ruling body in Jerusalem, presided over by the high priest. And the Sanhedrin is made up of 2 groups of people, the Sadducees, who I briefly mentioned, but we're going to get into the difference between these groups in another, actually probably next week, and the Pharisees. And he comes to the attention of the leaders of the Pharisaic leaders of the Sanhedrin, and becomes somebody who's well known to this group. Now, Paul probably, during his time in Jerusalem, probably came to know about Jesus, and may, this is all speculation, but may have even seen or heard him. We don't know that that's true, but it's, scholars think it's certainly a possibility. In 32 CE, following Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and the beginnings of the Christian movement, Paul is appointed as a member of the delegation that is ordered by the Sanhedrin to execute Stephen for disparaging the temple and criticizing the temple's priestly and Pharisaic leadership. He, according to Acts, he doesn't actually throw stones, but he is there on site. Acts tells us he holds the coats of those who are chucking stones at Stephen. That same year or a year later, Paul is deputized by the Sanhedrin to spy upon, to harass, and even arrest members of this early Jewish Christian movement. And there are probably 30 synagogues in Jerusalem at this time. And one of them, or perhaps two of them, had become Jewish Christian synagogues. And so as a part of his spying on this group, Paul would have probably come to know a fair amount about Jesus, who he was, what his message was, and so forth. Now, in the next year, in 34 CE, Paul is ordered by the Sanhedrin to travel to Damascus, which is a couple hundred miles to the north, where it's been reported that this Jesus movement has taken root primarily among Gentile God-fearers. Now, let me explain that. There were maybe, just roughly speaking, maybe 1 million Jews, probably less than that, but maybe 1 million Jews in Palestine. But there were 6 million Jews scattered throughout the Roman world. In as far away as Spain and certainly in what is modern day Italy and Greece and Turkey, Egypt. And 40% of the population of Alexandria, for example, was Jewish in Paul's day. And so these synagogues that were out in what's called the diaspora were populated, of course, by Jewish persons, but also by Gentiles who were referred to as God-fearers. Now, these were people who really liked the whole idea of one God, who liked the ethic of the God of Israel, who were very attracted to Judaism. They tended to be wealthier persons of some sophistication, who couldn't buy into some of the crazy Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, and who supported the synagogues financially. In fact, some of these synagogues, when they were built mostly with God-fearing Gentile money. But they didn't want to make that final step into Judaism, which involved them becoming circumcised and eating kosher food and giving up the kind of the civic holidays, which were all connected to pagan gods. It would be like somebody in our time, saying, I want to have nothing to do with St. Valentine's Day, nothing to do with St. Patrick's Day, nothing to do with Memorial Day, nothing to do with the 4th of July, nothing to do with any of the Halloween, any of that stuff. That's what diaspora Jews did in the places they lived. They renounced all of that civic religious stuff. And the Gentile God-fearers that were connected with the synagogues who liked Judaism, and as I said, they didn't want to get circumcised. They didn't want to quit eating pork, which was the favored meat in those days. And they didn't want to not have to give their wife a Valentine's Day present, or, drink green beer on March 17th, But otherwise, they were connected with the synagogues. And word came to Jerusalem that some of these God-fearers in the major synagogue in Damascus were kind of going over to this Jesus movement. And that was a problem for the temple in Jerusalem, because each year, everybody who was connected with the synagogue was required to give 2 days' wages to the temple in Jerusalem. And if we lose the God-fearers, we're losing some serious money. So Paul is sent there. Now it says in Acts to arrest them. He had no authority to arrest somebody outside of Judea. So that's wrong. But he would have gone there to debate them. His task was to use his prodigious Torah knowledge and rhetorical skills and his zeal for, his passion for religion, to dissuade these presumed apostates and keep the flow of money going. And of course, while en route, he has this experience of seeing the resurrected Jesus, about which I'm going to say more next week. And he goes into town. He's met by a guy, one of these Jewish, Ananias, who was Jewish. He wasn't a God-fearer. And he stays with Ananias, and he talk, and Paul learns more about the Christian enterprise, and comes to believe that Jesus was the long-promised Messiah. And I'm going to refer you to page 2 of the handout by way of seeing what it is that all fell into place for Paul in terms of Paul's understanding that Jesus was God's way of fulfilling promises, not only to the Jewish people, but to the world. In 35 and 36, Paul leaves Damascus, goes down to Arabia, where he practices his missionary work among Nabateans. Now, Nabatea was an area, a country, sort of south of Judah, down in the Arabian desert, and most of the Nabateans were Jewish, so he has a crowd that he can argue his newfound understanding of God's plan with. He stays there for a couple of years, and then when the Nabateans declare war against Herod Antipas, who was the king of Galilee, he becomes persona non grata and leaves, and goes up to Jerusalem and says, hey, James, John, Peter, I've been practicing missionary work down there in Nabatea. I had to leave because of the war, but give me a job. I want to go out and do missionary work. And they don't entirely trust Paul, because, he was there for the stoning of their friend Stephen and so forth. And so they say, well, Paul, I tell you what, let us sort on this. Let's think about what would be a good place for you. And why don't you go home to Tarsus, and we'll be in touch. Okay. And whether or not they planned ever to carve out a job for Paul is not entirely clear, but Paul says, all right. He goes back to Tarsus. He gets back involved with the tent making, awning making business with his family, becomes active in a Jewish Christian synagogue, continues to study, continues to practice missionary and evangelism work among the Jews there, and then begins probably to try missionary work among the Gentile God-fearers, and finds out that they're a much better prospect for conversion than are the Jews. And he begins to think about this kosher stuff and the circumcision stuff. And, it becomes clear here's the deal. God spoke to Abraham way back, and he said, I'll tell you what, the day will come when everybody in the whole world will look back to you as, the father of them all, that one day all the world will worship and follow me. And it's going to be you who will be, the founder of this tradition. And then later on, we get to the Exodus, and Moses says to the people, this thing that God set up with Abraham, that's going to happen. It's going to happen through us. And, when it happens, it's not clear to us, but we have to remain steadfast in our faith to Yahweh. And we can't, we can't water ourselves down by getting involved with pagan cultures. So in order to keep us together and separate, and the word that we translate as separate is holy. Holy doesn't mean that, you pray 6 times a day or what. It means that you're separate, you're different. In order to keep us holy, separate, here's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to be circumcised our males. It goes back to Abraham. We're going to have to not eat the food that everyone else eats. So most people, eat pork. That's a favored, meat on your table. We're not going to eat meat. We're not going to eat shellfish, which is also very popular, shrimp and clams and oysters, or birds of prey. We're going to wear our hair in a certain way. We're going to fast every Monday and Thursday, and we're not going to work on Saturday, and a bunch of other stuff. And if we all keep to these rules, we will keep together, so that we will be a cohesive group, so that when the time comes that God becomes known to all the world through us, there will be an us for this to happen. Okay. And so that's what the cultic rules are about. And as I mentioned earlier, Pharisees are more scrupulous about keeping these rules than anybody else. Well, Paul begins to think, well, you know what? Now the Messiah has come. So do at least Gentiles have to keep these rules? And he decides that they don't. And if all that is keeping these God-fearing Gentiles from becoming a part of the family is their fear of being circumcised, or their desire to eat what they've grown up with, pork and all of that, and their desire not to have to wear earlocks and have tassels on their clothes and so forth. What's the point of that? Okay. This is what, gets going in Paul's mind. And this is the beginning then of Paul thinking that his vocation will be a missionary to Gentiles. Okay. Now, he spends about 9 years in Tarsus, and Barnabas, who is not a disciple, but he's a part of the church in Jerusalem, who's been around from the beginning, is sent to Antioch of Syria. There are Christian synagogues there, but there's some disputes going on and so forth. And he's being sent there to kind of oversee them, settle some disputes and so forth. And he says, hey, I'm not sure that I'm up to this just by myself. Remember this guy, Paul? Several years ago, he was looking for a job, and he had memorized most of scripture. And the word is he's up in Tarsus, and he's been a member of a Christian Jewish synagogue for years. And could he could he partner with me on this job? Because he knows the Bible a lot better than I do. And the church in Jerusalem says, yeah, sure, we'll give it a try, see what happens. And so Barnabas connects with Paul, says, you want to go with me to Antioch of Syria and and see what's going on there, maybe help to grow the churches and so forth. And Paul says, absolutely. What has taken you so long? Let's go. And they do. And we're coming up to the end. I knew I wouldn't get through. I knew I wouldn't get through this. So I'm going to refer you to the handout, which will take you through the rest of Paul's life. But let me just, as an overview, very brief overview, say that what happens is that Barnabas and Paul spend a great year in Antioch of Syria. Paul has new insights about how the synagogue should be set up in a Christian way. A year later, the church in Jerusalem, pleased with how things have gone in Antioch of Syria, send Paul and Barnabas to Cyprus to start churches there. They go to Cyprus, have good success. From there, they go up to central Turkey, a province called Galatia, and get the crap beat out of them in another Antioch town, Pisidian Antioch. Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus was one of Alexander the Great's generals. So there are several towns named after him. And so there's, Paul is nearly killed, nearly stoned to death. After he leaves Antioch of Pisidia, he goes on to another town. But the result is that he founds churches, or they found churches in four of those central Turkish cities. And from there, Paul goes back, to Antioch of Syria, and on his second missionary journey, will retrace his steps, go over into Greece, northern Greece, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, down to Athens and Corinth, spend a couple of years in Corinth, and then go back to Jerusalem, but come back and will spend 3 years in Ephesus, which is in southwestern Turkey, and have some good success there, but he gets sent to jail and a couple of times there and is beaten. And after he's released from prison the second time, he goes back to Greece, goes back down to Corinth, and then from there he returns to Jerusalem, where he's arrested, spends 3 years in prison at Caesarea on the coast of Palestine, and then is sent to Rome for trial, is under house arrest for a couple of years, and but has freedom of movement. And then we don't know how he dies. Presumably he dies in the persecutions under Nero in 64. But there are traditions that say that he got to Spain and maybe beyond. I encourage you to read the handout. That's a quick overview. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about Pharisees, Sadducees, and we're going to talk about how Jesus and Paul are in concert with their beliefs. The rap has also often been made that Jesus preaches a different story than Jesus does. That is absolutely not true, and I'm going to show you that next week. That the ethics of Jesus are the ethic of Paul. And again, I encourage you to read the notes because there's just a lot that Tom and Gingy can tell you that the material that I just covered today, I took probably a month to cover with them. And our sessions didn't go for 50 minutes. They went for sometimes an hour and a half or more. So that's the overview. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'd be happy to answer them.
Hey, thanks very much, Gary. I think you have enough time to get coffee and go over to the church service. So I really look forward to hearing next week your presentation then too, Gary.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Matt.
Bet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And happy anniversary, Nancy and Terry.
Oh, yeah.
About it.
Thank you. It's not till the end of the month, but thank
Oh,
you.
darn.
Oh, you start celebrating early.
Yeah, my sister sent us flowers. Like, anyway, never mind.
Have a good week, all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Gary.